Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. In this particular episode of Fabulous Folklore Presents, we are sticking with the Witches, Cunning, Folk and Magic theme from the main feed of the podcast because I'm talking to Dave Silk, a storyteller and historian from Newcastle upon Tyne and co-author of Tyne and Wear Folktales for Children. He collects and retells traditional tales and ancient stories from around these isles and further afield, and enjoys rearing pet leeches and practising the dark arts. In the daytime, he's usually found doing his normal job of lurking in the dark towers of Newcastle Castle, where he is the learning manager. In this chat, we talk about the Newcastle Witch Trials, other witch cases from the region, and two of Newcastle's most famous cunning men. Enjoy! Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Hello, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I am alright, thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
It is quite cool that we're actually recording this in the Black Gate. This is probably the best venue that I've done an interview in.
Oh, there you go, yes. It's kind of a lush workplace as well. My office is upstairs in the Black Gate. I feel a bit like an orc.
So speaking of the fact we're in the Black Gate, obviously we are in Newcastle, as I think anyone listening can probably gather from our accents. But we are talking about the Newcastle Witch Trials, among other things. And I have mentioned them briefly in the Tyne and Wear episode, but I did want to come back and have a look at them properly. And as you're an actual historian, I figured, well, I'll get someone on who's going to know a bit more about it than me. So for anyone who's not familiar, how did the Newcastle Witch Trials get started and when were they?
So when we talk about the Newcastle Witch Trials, generally speaking, we're talking about one particular trial and set of executions. And it basically runs between 1649 and 1650. So March 1649 through to about August 1650. A petition is read in front of a corporation, that's basically the town council in the mid-17th century, saying that there are witches in the town. There is a problem in the town with sorcerers and witches. And two of the town's sergeants, Cuthbert Nicholson and a guy with the rather excellent name of Thomas Shovel, are sent up into Scotland to fetch a professional witchfinder. Now, 1649, we're saying there is a series of witch accusations going on in Berwickshire at the time. So it's possible that they're going to get someone who's involved in that because they're kind of, they know that that's going on. It might also just be that, Scottish people maybe had a bit more of a reputation for that kind of thing. If you know witch trials, I think about 500 people in total are executed for witchcraft during the English witch trials, over 2,000 in Scotland, with a much smaller population. So clearly Scottish people were better at finding witches because they found more of them. So they bring this guy down from Scotland and he has knowledge to find out witches by pricking them with pins, is where it said, and they would award him with 20 shillings apiece for all that he could condemn as witches. And he would have free passage into Newcastle and back. They get the bellman, who's your kind of like newsreader of the day, I suppose. He goes around the town ringing his little bell and calling the people out and saying that they should make complaints against anyone that they think might be a witch, and they would be sent for and they would be tried by the Witchfinder. In total, we're told 30 women are brought to the town hall, stripped and openly had pins thrust into their bodies, and 27 of them were found guilty and set aside during these trials.
Sorry, I was just looking up. So 20 shillings was around about £98.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
That's ridiculous.
It's a decent amount of cash, like.
Yeah. And obviously these things don't exist in a vacuum either, and I think that's something that people sometimes assume that someone just went around and went, witch it, whoever they didn't like. But what was the context like surrounding the sort of this particular period? So why now? Why this sort of set of people?
Yeah, so I think Newcastle, in 1649 certainly, I think the word is maybe something like febrile for like the atmosphere, if we want a nice fancy word for it. 1649 January sees the execution of King Charles I, the first European monarch ever to be executed by his own people. It's hard to underestimate what a kind of massive event that was for people. It's a seismic event, not just in history, but like in people's daily lives. They feel that, a lot of people felt the natural order had been overturned. You know what I mean? Like the world was gone crazy. It had been turned upside down. But That came at the climax, obviously, of the Civil War, which had just been massively destructive, cost huge numbers of lives. In terms of percentage of the population who died during that war, it's probably the most destructive war in British history. Newcastle's regiment of 3,000 men raised from Newcastle for the war's 30 came back to the city after the Battle of Marston Moor. They had been from the surroundings as well, but absolutely horrendous casualty rate. Most of them were killed in a single battle. Newcastle had been occupied up until 1647 by the Army of the Covenant. That's the Scottish National Army, effectively. Having been besieged before that in 1644, massive loss of life again. So, Newcastle has been through a lot by that point. When the Scots leave, it's under the rule of a sort of puritanical town council that would have been very much at odds with a lot of the people in the town, a lot of whom were royalist sympathisers. The siege of Newcastle was only 4 years after the last time that a Scottish army had invaded Newcastle and taken it over, which was after the Battle of Newburn Ford in the Bishops' Wars, which start off the English Civil Wars. And that was only 4 years after a massive outbreak of the plague killed about 5,000 people in Newcastle, which might represent somewhere around half the population of the town. So, this is a town that has undergone a series of massive, world-changing disasters for the people inside it, basically. Plague, battle, siege, starvation, and then Puritans. What could be worse? So it's not a great atmosphere, I think, and people were looking for somebody to blame for it, and witches get the blame, basically. And I think into that you can chuck that, obviously, civil wars are political. That's the kind of the nature of any war, really. But there's an open possibility that a lot of these accusations may have been political. You've got a town corporation or council who are very much politically on the other side from a lot of the big families and a lot of the people living in the town. And I think that there's a possibility there, like an undercurrent, that there's a kind of political aspect to some of these accusations, basically.
Yeah. So how many people were ultimately involved? And I've separated the question into two parts, and then how many people ended up becoming victims of the trials? Because I know that not everyone who was accused actually ended up on trial, and then not everybody actually ended up being executed. So you sort of have a whittling down. So how do the numbers work?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, actually, because so in that original source that I read from, that's sort of one of our main sources for the trials. He talks about 30 people being brought to the Guildhall. He says 30 women, and 27 of them were found guilty by the Witchfinder and set aside. There's some interesting little anecdotes around that as well. He talks about, there's a Lieutenant Colonel Hobson, who's a military surgeon in the Scottish Army, and he sees a young woman being brought in to be tried, and he says, "Oh, surely she's not a witch. She's far too pretty to be a witch." And the Witchfinder tells him, "Oh no, she is a witch. I can tell a witch just by looking at her." I mean, how he explained the 3 that he didn't manage to get convictions on him with that, I don't know. But he says, "Yeah, I know a witch when I see one," sort of thing. And he jabs the pin into her, and she doesn't bleed. And that's the sure sign. That's like, when they talk about stripping and pricking with these pins, the idea was that when you become a witch, you get the devil's mark on you, where your familiar suckles blood. And if the Witchfinder pops a pin in that mark, it won't bleed or feel any pain. It's insensible. And so he kind of does this woman, and she doesn't bleed, and they say, "Oh, that's a sure sign." But Hobson says, "No. You see, you lifted her skirts up over her head as you did it. She blushed with shame to be kind of exposed in front of all of the people in the town, and the blood must have rushed to her face, and therefore there was no blood left in her leg." And he says, "Give me the pin," and he jabs it into somewhere in her leg without uncovering her, and blood is drawn from this same point. And they kind of go, "Oh, all right, then she's not a witch." And so she gets let off because she's young and pretty.
As people say, the pretty privilege doesn't exist.
Exactly, outrageous. But yeah, so the Witchfinder has this kind of process anyway. And I mean, I think the suggestion there as well is that he's palming the needle, or there's some kind of sleight of hand or some kind of trickery going on here, which Hobson is kind of wise to. And so we have these 27 people who are found by him. But in the end, the actual records of the executions have 15 people. Now, you'll see all sorts of numbers coming up on this, I want to say, in loads of different... If you read websites, it goes between 14, 15, 16. 14 tends to be, people say, 14 women were executed. Now, that's true, but there was a bloke executed as well.
Yeah.
He's not mentioned in the original source. So it says 30 women are brought and examined. But yeah, one of the executed is a man. The 16 is because they often mix in another victim, I suppose, who is actually executed on the same day for stealing silver spoons. But she is listed by, like, the initial source as being a witch as well. So there's some argument about whether she belongs. But 15 people are executed on the town moor in August 1650. And you've got Matthew Bulmer, Elizabeth Anderson, Jane Hunter, Mary Potts, Alice Hume, Margaret Moffat, Margaret Madison, Elizabeth Brown, Margaret Brown, Jane Coupland, Anne Watson, Eleanor Henderson, Elizabeth Dobson, Catherine Coulter, and Jane Martin. So they are the 15 executed witches. They're executed alongside a few other thieves and moss troopers.
What are moss troopers, just for anyone who's not familiar with them?
So moss troopers are basically bandits. They're sort of bandits on the... it's a word for kind of roving rogues and bandits on the borders between England and Scotland. They roam the mosses, which are the kind of what the moors are usually called in the old sources. In actual fact, in this period of history, they're probably royalist partisans, I suppose. Something like in Irish ballads, you have the figure of the Rapparee, who's the kind of a royalist bandit out in the woods fighting Cromwell's troops. They're a kind of similar figure to that, really, I think. But there's 11 of them hanged on the same day as well. So there's a lot going on the town moor on that day. And yeah, 15 witches in one go is one of the largest mass hangings of witches in English history. It's a huge deal, actually, a massive trial.
So why is it then, and we'll come back to more of the evidence and so on, but based on that, and I think I already know why they're not as well known as some of the other ones, but given the size of and scope of what happened, why is it that it's so much less well known? Like the number of people I've met in Newcastle who've been born and bred here who didn't realise we had a witch panic, as it were, and other parts of the country tend to focus very much on places like Pendle or Coggeshall and all these other different places. Why does Newcastle get forgotten about? Is it regional bias, or is it just that the sources aren't particularly good?
I think there's a few possibilities here, actually. I think it's a really interesting thing to speculate about. I think it's tempting to say that they were deliberately suppressed by the town corporation. So our main source, when we're talking about sources of evidence for it, our main source is a guy called Ralph Gardner, who writes a book with the thrillingly punchy title of England's Grievance Discovered in Relation to the Coal Trade.
Wow.
And he is a merchant from North Shields, which for people outside the region is a little town outside Newcastle, a little coastal town. And in the 1600s, it was heavily suppressed by the merchants of Newcastle who had monopolies on things like the coal trade. And Gardner, coming from North Shields, wanted to show that the town corporation of Newcastle were evil, horrible monopolists who, suppressed the people of the surrounding areas and were cruel and stupid and superstitious and, executed their own people in a panic at, inviting down mercenary Scottish witchfinders to come and do people in. And there does actually, I think, seem to be, in some of the sources, a measure of embarrassment about the whole thing. And I think the town corporation were not big to, promote this. There was nothing ever came out in terms of a pamphlet of look at this wonderful thing we've done by getting rid of these horrible witches and sorcerers kind of thing. It was all very quietly hushed up after it had happened. But I think another reason is to do with the records. They're incomplete compared to Pendle or Matthew Hopkins. There's none of the kind of juicy details that you get in those. Matthew Hopkins he records all the names of the familiars of the witches that he finds and all the horrible things that they did. And, the Pendle witches, you've got all this stuff in the depositions of them all accusing each other. You've got all this brilliant family dynamic in play between the two witch families, as it were. There's nothing like that in Newcastle. We know next to nothing about the people who were executed involved, with one exception. Interestingly, I think the best known part of the Newcastle Witch Trials is an illustration from Gardner's England's Grievance Discovered, which I think most people will have seen because I see it used all over the place. Whenever there's an article about witch trials or a TV programme about witch trials, this picture pops up and they'll talk about the Pendle Witch Trials, and you'll see this picture of 4 women being hanged on a gallows, and there's a guy in a massive hat getting some money off someone next to them. That's the Newcastle Witch Trials. That is an illustration of Newcastle, and it's labelled in Gardner's book, but it's used all over the place, but almost never to talk about Newcastle.
Because I know when you talk about where they were executed, obviously, as I say, I've got an episode on the town moor, and for anyone who's not familiar, it is a huge parcel of land, and there will no doubt be people laughing at the way that I say moor as well. But I heard a rumour, and I have no idea if this is true, and I'm sure I've asked you this on Facebook before, but somebody came out with this thing a while ago that where the gallows would have been is where St James's Park stands now, which obviously is where Newcastle United plays. Is there any truth to that? Because obviously that originally that part of land was taken off Leeches Park.
Yeah.
So could that have been right? Because I always imagine it would have happened out on the moor where there was more space, but that's based on the layout as it is now.
Yeah, I mean, actually, so where St James's Park was open moorland in the 17th century. I think what most people base that on is the best way we have to locate where the gallows were is actually, again, Gardner. He's got a little map in the back of his book, and he's got a wee map of... It's not Northumberland, but it's like the sort of area, the Tyne, I guess, like the area around the Tyne. So what we would call sort of North Tyneside now, up to Newcastle, and a little bit of South Tyneside as well, so South Shields and Jarrow. And he does show on that, so you can see, it's got like a little map of Newcastle with its walls surrounding it, and just out north of it, you can see on Killingworth Moor, there's a big horse race going on, but just south of that, between Newcastle's walls and the horse racing, is a tiny little gallows with a little man hanging off it. And whether that is supposed to be precisely representative of that is where the gallows were, or whether it's just kind of part of the decoration of the map, essentially, to say, you know, people were executed out on the town moor, we don't really know. But it's not massively far out. So, yeah, somewhere around like Barrack Road, like Leeches Park, that kind of end of the town moor is probably about right. Because the gallows actually don't stay up all the time.
No.
I think that's what people also forget. Is I think people imagine that there were like executions constantly going on in this time period, and that actually isn't true. You know, most years there were no executions, so they didn't need a gallows, and they were just erected whenever they were needed. So they would have put one up for this purpose. Whether they were always put on the same spot or not, I think, is something we just don't know, actually. So, But yeah, probably somewhere around St James's Park would be as good a guess as any.
Well, that was what confused me when I did the Lockburn episode, and I discovered that they'd hanged Jane Jameson down by the Guildhall, and I thought, now, would they have picked, perhaps, the Town Moor area for such a large hanging compared to down on Sandhill, just because that was only one person, whereas this is obviously 15 or however many it would be in total with all the other ones added in? Was it often just... I can't believe we're discussing logistics, but do you know what I mean? Like, you start thinking, why would they pick that far out? But then again, I suppose, because why wouldn't they? Because they'll have more space. Yeah,
get the crowds in as well, you know, like these are public events. Hangings were a big deal. So, you know, it's a place where people can gather and, you know, crowds can come and watch justice being done, as it were.
So I just got a mental image of when the Newcastle had the team there celebrating getting the Carabao Cup. Oh, imagine if it was on the same spot. Justice is done. Anyway, the thing that I think fascinates me with this story is the fact that there's a man involved. And I think that while, yes, it is right to notice that a lot of the witch trials do involve female victims, but I do think that then overlooks the men who are caught up in it. So what do we know about Matthew Bulmer?
So Matthew Bulmer, however you spell his name, it's spelled a number of different ways in different sources. But basically all we really know about him, he is a blacksmith. He's a burgess of Newcastle, so he's a citizen of the town. Free citizen, for what that's worth. Doesn't necessarily mean he's particularly rich or anything like that. But yeah, he works as a blacksmith. And he appears in a few court records before the witch trials for a number of kind of petty disputes with his neighbours. And there's no real hint of sorcery here, but what it does hint at, I think, is that he maybe wasn't very well liked, or he was just kind of one of these characters that's always getting into like fights with their neighbours and, you know, kind of getting involved in sort of disputes and things of that sort. So I think it tells you a lot about witch trials in England, which do have this character sometimes of working out local tensions, shall we say, between people by accusing them of witchcraft.
Yeah, I think this is a thing that's come out of this whole series, really, the idea that when you look at the tensions that happen even just in a Facebook group now, that writ large with the idea that, you know, you could potentially just go, I'm going to accuse you of witchcraft. You just think there's people who are spiteful enough who would.
Oh, yeah. I mean, no question, absolutely. And lots of it seems to come down to things around inheritance. And it's also worth, you know, people believed in this stuff. So because you have a dispute with someone doesn't stand against the fact that they might be trying to hurt you. Your belief might turn to the idea that they're trying to harm you in some way. And I think a lot of people genuinely believed that you could be harmed through supernatural methods in this period of history, you know. And blacksmiths, you know, I guess have a bit of a magical aura around them, don't they? It's a strange art, I think.
Well, it's basically like fancy alchemy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the thing that always gets me as well is the fact that if you think that this person is trying to harm you, would then accusing them and riling them up further really be necessarily the right thing to do?
Well, yeah, possibly not. I mean, if you can get them hanged, like poor old Matthew Bulmer, then, I suppose that gets rid of your problem. There are other ways, of course, of protecting yourself against witches. I mean, cold iron actually is one of them, which is mentioned in, I think it's Henderson's Folklore of Northern Counties, mentions a few occasions of touching cold iron to prevent witchcraft. But another one that's actually comes up in a number of different trials is cutting the witch, drawing blood from them. Said to break their spells as well. So
yeah, you get these horrible images of people sort of going up to some poor old woman and then just scratching her until she bleeds and then going, oh, now this is all finished. And it's just like, hey, did you wash your hands? Like that just feels...
it's pretty ghastly. You're supposed to cut them above the eyes, apparently.
God, that would take...
A few local scholars have written about that. Dr. Joe Bath and Dr. Katie Ledane have both written about sort of reverse witch trials, where people in the 1800s were being put on trial for slashing old ladies with razors over their eyes because they believed that they'd been bewitched and had no legal recourse because witchcraft wasn't something you could accuse people of anymore. So,
I don't know, the things people do. What happened to the Witchfinder though? Because he's quite an interesting character because he doesn't just disappear quietly into the night.
Well, yeah, he's a funny one. So Gardner is the main source for him as well. He asserts that he went up into Northumberland after being in Newcastle, where he's essentially turfed out of Northumberland by Sir Henry Ogle, MP.
Excellent name.
Who is the Ogles, very old family in Northumberland. Ogle Hall is they're kind of always turned up as justices of the peace and various things like that. And yeah, he arrests him and binds him over to appear at the sessions. He's then sent to go back up into Scotland. He escapes this and disappears back up into Scotland, but he is laid hold of in Scotland and put on trial for being a fraud. At his trial, he's supposed to have confessed to causing the deaths of 220 innocent people.
That's quite a lot.
That is a lot for 20 shillings apiece. That is good few grand. And he was executed. Unfortunately, we don't know his name because Gardner does not name him, which isn't very helpful because it means we can't really corroborate that against our sources. The idea that witchfinders might be frauds is something that crops up in a few different sources. So you've got Reginald Scott and the discovery of witchcraft, which was from a generation before the Newcastle Witch Trials. That's from the late 1500s, and he talks about witchfinders using retractable bodkins to do this sort of pricking, so that they could kind of decide whether somebody was going to be guilty or not, and what have you. But yeah, it's an interesting one because it does sound a little bit too good to be true in some ways, isn't it? Gardner is able to then say, well, he confessed to being a fraud, so we know that the town council were taken in by a fraud, and he was executed, which is nice kind of, it's not exactly a happy ending, but you know what I mean? He at least gets his just desserts sort of thing. But without knowing who he was, it's hard to, as I say, corroborate that. There's a few different theories about who he might have been, and I think that I remember having a chat recently with Katie Ledane, who knows a lot about this kind of era, and she was saying that George Cathy is possibly the most likely candidate for the Newcastle Witchfinder. His career seems to allow for him to be in Newcastle in that time period, and I think he does vanish from records around that time as well, so it is possible that he gets done in for being a fraud. It's
just fascinating, and if there's so little information about him, I know that there are some sources, contemporary sources I'm talking about, as in now, who claim that the Witchfinder stayed at Bolbec Gardens, which is where the Little Phil is now. So I'm not quite sure how we would know where he was staying if we don't even know who he was.
Yeah, Gardner doesn't tell us anything like that. The Guildhall is where the trial takes place. The Guildhall is on the site of the current Guildhall. The current Guildhall building dates to slightly after the period of the witch trials, 1660s, I think, actually.
Yes.
So it's kind of just afterwards. But the Guildhall itself was on that site from 1215 onwards. So.
I think the other thing as well with the Witchfinder, the idea of him then being done for fraud and everything, you do sort of think people must have had some awareness in order for him to propose that these people might not necessarily always be entirely on the level.
Well, yeah, I think, that's... certainly in Scotland, some people were arrested for being witchfinders without a licence, which is, I find quite interesting, isn't it? Where, you can get a licence from the local authorities to be a witchfinder or something. So, yeah, there was a sense that, if you could do anything, claim to do it for money, then you could be a fraud. The numbers involved, I think, are interesting with that as well. Because let's say he identifies 27 people, only 15 end up being executed. Now, it's possible that some people died in prison. That hardly unheard of in the 17th century. Prisons were horrendous places to be, even for a fairly short period of time. But Gardner doesn't mention that, and I think, he's really got an axe to grind about this, and I think if those people had languished in prison and died, I'm sure he would have mentioned it, and he doesn't. So I think only 15 people end up on trial at the assizes, and having a guy jab you with a pin is all well and good, but that's not enough in English law, even in the 17th century, to convict you of a crime. You need a trial with a jury, and those people are eventually then found guilty by the jury as well. And presumably part of the evidence will be, well, I jabbed them with a pin and nothing came out. But that wouldn't have been all that was raised in the court, I'm sure. So it's difficult to say how that works really, and how people squared that away. And we know actually that there was, some of the interesting records are, there was a lady called Eleanor Lumsdale who spent a year in prison in Newgate in Newcastle for trying to discourage people from giving evidence against Margaret Brown, who was one of the executed witches. So she basically was openly saying the Witchfinder was a fraud, this is, she's not a witch. And she spent time in prison for that, for her friend, basically. And Margaret Brown is mentioned by Gardner as well in the source, because he says, I find this quite telling as well, and if this is a story that was current in Newcastle, it would explain maybe why the town council wanted to hush it up as well. Margaret Brown insisted that she was innocent all the way up to the gallows, and she prayed God send a sign upon these people that they are executing an innocent woman. And as soon as they turned her off the ladders and she fell, blood is said to have gushed out of her mouth and fallen onto the crowd watching her execution below. And this was seen as a sign from God, basically, that she had been innocent. Horrible suspicion she might just have bitten her tongue or something, which is if you're strangling on a gallows, I imagine is something that can happen. But there's this sense that something happened that made people go, oh, hang on, we've done something a bit naughty here. And I think there was already a sense that it had been hysteria by the time the trials had ended.
I think that's the thing. I was also wondering as well, when you say that there's the number that are accused and then the number that are actually put on trial. And this is a weird way that my brain works, but I suddenly thought, would that mean that would you get paid for the accusation, or only if the accusation got taken to trial?
Well, I don't know what the contract that the Witchfinder had was. It says sort of for each witch that he found, so I assumed it would only be for convicted witches, I guess. Who knows? I don't know what I guess that would come down to your individual contract. Probably negotiate that with the council. Indeed.
So, obviously we've talked about this particular incident, as it were. I hate calling it that because it doesn't sound big enough for what it actually is. And obviously there's no memorial to these people anywhere, which I think people have been campaigning for one in, because they're buried in St Andrew's churchyard, aren't they?
Yes. So they are, they were buried in St Andrew's. Supposedly they might have been discovered in the 1990s. Some builders, it was in the Chronicle, which is the local newspaper, some builders dug up some skeletons in an unmarked, in an area with no marked graves in, and one of them touched the bones and said that he came up with a rash on the bits where the bones had touched afterwards. And I just remember, I just kind of think, God, even 400 years later, people are still blaming witches for, bloke gets a rash on his hand and he's like, that's witchcraft, that is. But it might have been them, they likely would have been buried either on the north side of the church or in an unmarked grave. It's interesting they were buried in the churchyard at all, of course, and again, maybe hints that, there was some doubt about their guilt. But yeah, actually, it's something I've been involved in is looking to work with the city council to get a memorial put up to the victims of the witch trials somewhere in the city. There's no permanent memorial. It's looking more likely, we're looking at sites around the Guildhall as a possibility at the moment, but we'll be looking to do a funded project at some point in the near future, in the short to medium term, maybe next year for that. So yeah, that is something that we're actively looking at the castle here.
That would be good.
Yes, I think so.
So did Newcastle actually have many of these happening in sort of the decades and centuries prior? Or, because one of the things I often think when you look at a lot of the more famous trials and whatever, they tend to happen in either smaller towns or more rural areas. And obviously Newcastle, even in those days, would have still been a big-ish town. So would you still have had trials going on in Newcastle, or would it have been more out in the surrounding areas?
So you have some in the sticks, certainly. There's a really famous one in 1670s where a young girl called Anne Armstrong, who is a servant girl, starts accusing her neighbours of being witches. She says that they transform her into a horse and ride around on her at night, and they go to the Sabbat. It's actually one of the very few mentions of the witches' Sabbat, like this kind of like cult gathering in English trials. It's really rare. It's not something that crops up in England a lot. And she says that they would pull on a rope that came out of nowhere, the devil's sort of magical rope, and then they would eat plum-baked capons, currant bread, beef pies, and mutton.
That doesn't sound that bad.
I mean, it sounds alright, doesn't it? Like, but I do think it's kind of... It's one of those things, isn't it, where, like, you know, that's the height of luxury that you can possibly imagine as a servant girl in the 17th century. It's like, you know, there's nothing greater than that she could possibly envisage. But, and I mean, that's out in Northumberland. That is very rural, in a Derwentdale area. But that's thrown out of court. She was considered to be a fantasist, basically, and the case was kind of chucked out. But there are a number of other witch trials in Newcastle, not just before the Newcastle Witch Trials, actually. 1660s, see a whole load of them brought before various magistrates, and we have a lot more detail on some of these because we get the depositions are published in the 19th century by the Surtees Society. There's a load of depositions from York Castle, which include some stuff from Northumberland, County Durham. And yeah, they've got loads of details of people, as I say, doing kind of accused of... Sometimes it's stuff like, you know, tormenting people with spirits, a bit like the Salem witch trials, kind of accusations. So, you know, people who have an argument with someone because they won't give them money, and then they say, you know, you'll be sorry, and then they start seeing them, tormenting them. So we've got one where a guy's wife is... I'm just going to see if I can actually find it on here. Around the 20th of January last, in 1659, Elizabeth, the wife of George Simpson of Tynemouth, fisherman, came into his house and asked for a pot full of small beer from Frances Mason, the daughter of the informant. She, refusing, the said Elizabeth threatened to make her repent, and on the next day Frances lost the use of one of her legs, and 4 days later the use of the other one, and then she became lame and lay in bed miserably tormented, crying out that the said Elizabeth did pinch her heart and pull her into pieces. But the informant, drawing blood from Elizabeth, so it's this ritual of kind of trying to draw blood from the witch, ever since she has continued quiet in her bed without any torture, but she has not recovered the use of her limbs. And it also then goes on to say that the said Elizabeth is reported to be a charmer who turns the sieve for money and is therefore reputed a witch. So that's a reference to, as I'm sure you have mentioned, the sieve and shears, which is a classic sort of folk magic ritual for finding lost objects. So people sometimes are caught up in these who are have a real magical practice of some sort going on. And we see that again with someone who is, Mrs. Pepper. A midwife saw her call for a bottle of water. So this actually goes to something around midwives often not being accused of witches, but actually being called in evidence against witches. Sprinkled a bottle of holy water upon a red-hot spot on the back of his right hand, took a silver crucifix from her breast and laid it upon the spot, and said she knew by the said spot what his disease was, and then put the crucifix in his mouth. So these are kind of these sort of folk magic kind of rituals that some of these people are being accused of doing, that they're being dragged up in front of magistrates for, accused of witchcraft. But I mean, you know, it's interesting. No, you know, these aren't like non-Christian rites. She's using a crucifix and holy water, and a lot of the time when they talk about them in that same one, actually, they talk about people putting a duck on somebody's mouth and then mumbling their charms in a damnable and horrible manner. But the charms, when they're recorded, actually are often Catholic prayers. Yeah. And in the Newcastle trials, he never comes to trial, but there is another man implicated in one of the trials. So Jane Martin is the witch that we've got the most information about, I think. I'm putting witch in inverted commas here all the time, by the way. You can't hear that if I'm recording it, but because obviously they weren't really witches. They are innocent people accused of being witches, but that's a bit long-winded to say every time. And yeah, the Jane Martin story is really interesting, where that's the one where we've got the most information about, and she's from outside Newcastle. So she is the miller's wife in Chatton, which is quite far north in Northumberland, not far from Bamburgh, really.
Oh, okay. Well, that is quite far.
Yeah, it's real Northumberland stuff. She is accused alongside a wealthy woman called Dorothy Swinnow and her sister, who's called Margaret White. So we've got Margaret White and Jane Martin, who are sisters. Margaret White is the Webster's wife of Chatton, so they're like weaver. This woman called Mary Moore writes that her daughter has fell ill and had strange visions that continued for weeks of her fighting things in the shape of bears, cows and dragons. And they're worried that she is afflicted with some kind of witchcraft. And they do a kind of weird, I guess, a ritual that I think it's called sortilege usually. So you flick through the Bible,
yes,
and you like pop your finger on it on a random word on a random page, and you try and get some idea of what's going on from that. And they come across the letters, they pick letters out, individual letters out, and they get Joe Who, J-O and H-U, and Do Swo, D-O-S-W-O. And they judge that this means Dorothy Swinnow and John Hutton. John Hutton is reputed to be a charmer or cunning man who lives in, they just say Sunderland in the source. It doesn't mean Sunderland south of Newcastle, it's North Sunderland, which is also quite near Bamburgh and Chatham and places like that. And they basically drag him in, and he is effectively like beaten up in prison by the sounds of it, is the hint in the pamphlet. They beat him up to get names out of him, and he says, yes, Dorothy Swinnow is a witch, and so is Margaret White. And Margaret White confesses that she's a witch, and that so is her sister Jane Martin. And she confesses that she had been the devil's servant for 5 years and had a familiar which came to her in the likeness of a black greyhound, and that Dorothy, Jane, and herself would frequently eat together with Satan. Which sounds nice, doesn't it?
It's like have an afternoon tea.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's like, there's only 4 of them. It's not like a witch's sabbat. It's like some like mad orgy.
They've got finger sandwiches.
Yes, they sit around and they have a little bit of like some snacks and stuff. It's like a little kind of work meeting sort of thing. Jane Martin is accused of causing the death of a guy called Thomas Young by making a kiln of oats explode with her mind. Like her magic
that's gone
powers.
into Scanner's territory now.
Yeah, so she explodes a load of oats and blows them up, and Jane certainly is dragged down to Newcastle, where she would have been imprisoned, not in Newgate. So Newgate is one of the gates of the town wall. That's used for the people from Newcastle who are accused, because that is the prison for Newcastle. She comes from Northumberland, so she's locked up in the prison for Northumberland, which is the Castle Keep. Mm-hmm. So she would have been locked in the old dungeon in the Castle Keep, the ground floor sort of cellar, basically, was used as a prison for the assizes. And she would have been held in there before her trial, and sadly, eventually in August 1650, her execution on the town moor, along with the other Newcastle witches.
Mm. It just always makes me kind of think, were people legitimately misunderstanding, for example, a genuine medical condition? Because when you're describing the visions that this person was having, and I think some of the fever dreams I've sometimes had, or the weird dreams I have when I've got a migraine, and you sort of think, if you didn't know that you were having a migraine, you could quite easily think, oh my God, I've been bewitched. And you do sometimes think, so are these people sometimes making accusations that aren't necessarily, how do I put it? They're not necessarily malicious, but they're just completely misunderstood what's going on. Yeah. Or am I trying to give them a little bit too much credit?
No, I think there's loads of elements of that. I think it's it's like everything. It's a massive old mishmash of things. I think, once people start having these kind of medical episodes or something's happening with them, and then they don't understand how that's come about or what causes that, and then they start to associate this with various people who they don't like in the village, who've wished them ill, or the day beforehand have said, oh, you're going to regret not giving me that beer, and then all of a sudden you fall ill. Yeah, I think people probably do have a bit of a they caused it. So I think there is a genuine belief in that kind of magic, and I think there is a misunderstanding of mental health and other and medical conditions that can cause that, things that can cause fits and hallucinations and all sorts, really. And, a lot of it can be mental health related as well, I think. I don't know what was up with poor Anne Armstrong, but I think, going around accusing all her neighbours of being witches, I don't think that was purely malice. You sort of get the impression from the trial records that there is something going on with her, and whether it's just that it's a young girl who's been sort of turfed out of home to go into service and doesn't really know her sort of place and is kind of making all this stuff up, or whether she is actually suffering from some kind of mental illness is hard to know, really.
Mm. So obviously, I know it's quite difficult trying to explain this to people, the fact that Northumberland and Newcastle were sort of seen as these two different entities, and that you end up with these different parts of the city used to hold people. So was the castle used to hold any other accused witches, or is that the only one that we've really got on record?
That's the only one we've got on record, but technically anyone accused, if they were brought up before the Northumberland assizes, they would have been held in the castle beforehand, up until the very early 1800s. That was the prison. So it wasn't used as long-term kind of prison space. It would probably only have been for about a week or so. You've been brought down from any of the various prisons near where you actually lived, where you would have been held before your trial. You'd have been brought down for the assizes, and you would have been locked essentially in the cellar of the castle, chained to the walls. We've still got the metal rings set into the stone walls there where people were chained, and were left there for about 7 days usually before their trial, as the judges and the sheriffs and stuff all filed in. And the courthouse was in the castle grounds as well. Mm-hmm. So that was actually roughly, there's a hotel there now, and a courthouse opposite that, a more modern courthouse. But it was an old feasting hall of the castle, but it was repurposed by the 1500s as a courthouse, and that's where the assizes were held. So other witches, it's quite possible some of the people in the stuff in the Surtees Society, if those depositions ended up at trial, they would probably have been locked up in the castle as well, held there, and then put on trial at the assizes. In most of those cases, as Aspie said, the other Newcastle trials that we know about, we've got no records of executions, which suggests that those people were actually acquitted. So good news for them.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm getting quite interested in this idea that's been coming up in quite a lot of these chats I've been having, at the number of accusations that maybe didn't even get a trial, but then the ones that when they did get a trial, the judge or whoever was just like, out of my sight, this is nonsense. And I think they're the ones where I almost feel like they give you some hope that it wasn't always necessarily this huge thing. And obviously where those do flare up, there's other things at play, and then just, people going kind of just not liking their neighbours.
Very much so, I think. I mean, if you look at like the English witch trials particularly, the majority of executions for witchcraft in English history are carried out under one man, and it's Matthew Hopkins in East Anglia and Norfolk, and he is operating illegally. He's not the Witchfinder General, that's not a thing. He just called himself that because he was a lawyer, and he's operating during the Civil War, like literally in the middle of the war. So he's in a war zone. There is like no legal authority going on. There are no actual trials being held. So when he's turning up to do stuff, he is essentially holding illegal trials and executions of people. He's whipping up hysteria among people who are in the midst of a horrible war, and using that to execute people and get cash out of them. Where you have proper legal procedures being followed, usually in English cases, the judges are a bit more sceptical of a lot of the evidence. I even remember, I don't know how, I couldn't quote the source on this one, but I do remember having a word with Dr. Jo Bath once, and she told me about a case where to prove witchcraft in English law, you have to prove that somebody's been hurt by magic, maleficium, the sort of evil magic. And one of the bits of evidence was brought in front of the court and sort of said, well, she flew past my window one night, like, on a goat or something, like as evidence. And the judge said, well, there is nothing in the statute books that forbids flying, or something like this. like that. And he's like, well, I can't do anything about that. Flying's not against the law. If you can fly on a goat, good luck to you, And I like to think that they were a bit more, they were quite sceptical about a lot of these claims.
I also like the idea of someone being so pedantic that would be what their recourse is. Well, it's not illegal to do that.
Nothing in here about flying on a goat.
Well, I think the thing that you've mentioned as well a couple of times is the slight slippage, which I must admit I think it seems a lot rarer between witches and cunning people. And obviously cunning folk, as I discussed with Tabitha Stanmore as well. But one of the things I love about Newcastle is we've got two of the most fun, if that's the right word, the most interesting cunning men in particular. And I've mentioned Peter Banks on the podcast before, and I just think he's just one of those people who's seen a business opportunity and gone for it. So I'd love to have seen him on like a 17th century Dragon's Den trying to pitch that to someone. Because for a fact that like one of them would have gone for it. And then we've got the infamous Black Jackie Johnson, who I'm convinced never actually died and is just bimbling round removing mentions of himself from the sources because he keeps disappearing. So given how popular they both seem to be, and particularly Peter Banks, I mean, he had repeat business. He sort of invented like magic as a subscription service, really. Do you think that Novocastrians really did believe wholeheartedly in magic? Or do you think that the cunning men were more a case of this saw an opportunity, so they went for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people absolutely were believers in magic and the supernatural, and I think you see a lot of that in all of those depositions. I think you see the shape of that belief, in sort of apparitions and being able to be afflicted by people, but also all of these little, that sort of folksy magic, like turning the riddle to find lost or stolen objects and, putting ducks on people's mouths and all of that sort of stuff. And like Black Jackie, I think, is a really interesting character because I think he kind of straddles two worlds almost for me because he's quite late. He dies in 1837 in Byker, which is where he lives by that point, because the town council of Newcastle decide that they don't like the idea of a wizard living in the town. You know, it's a modern town. They're building a railway, for goodness sakes. You know what I mean? They're about to build Central Station. They're the home of the Industrial Revolution. They don't want some sorcerer hanging out in here. So they kick him out to Bicester, which is a much more suitable place for a malevolent necromancer to live.
Also, where my mother's from as well.
There you go. Just down the road from where I'm from as well. So there we are. But he sort of has. There's elements of what he does that I think are quite. I hesitate to say modern, but he is regarded as being a kind of necromancer. He's got a book of spells that's written by Agrippa, a great sort of 16th century German magician, and all of this kind of stuff. But he also is a tarot reader. We know he reads the cards and stuff like that. And we're told that he has a great following. He has a kind of obituary in a history of Newcastle written shortly after he died, where he's called the Professor of the Occult Science, which is a job title avidly to be wished for.
Yeah.
And he says that he had a huge following among not only people who wanted to find stolen goods, said that his reputation was such that even the word getting out that he was looking for things meant people would return stolen goods because he was seen as being infallible in finding them, but particularly among young women who wanted to go and ask him who they were going to marry or get in touch with dead relatives. And I think there's something of the kind of spiritual medium almost about him as well. A little bit earlier than that normally crops up. And, in a sense, is a spiritual medium a necromancer?
Well, there is an argument to be made that there is a lot of similarities between them. But I'm thinking if that was 1837 that he died, he would have been obviously operating before that. And obviously the Fox sisters don't decide to start inventing spiritualism until 1848. So... Yeah. Is there a claim to be made that spiritualism started
invented
here?
in Newcastle? Well, maybe.
So we gave the world the railways and Newcastle brown ale, and now apparently spiritualism.
There you go. Maybe.
What a weird Venn diagram.
I know, it's a good one though, isn't it? But yes, and in the personage of none other than the inimitable Black Jackie Johnson, John Johnson of Dogbank.
In my head, he is just like John Constantine, to be completely fair, and and more people should be, in my humble opinion. But I just think he's really interesting because, there's so little about him, but he does then pop up in different sources, and you just think he sounds so interesting. You
do hear a lot about him, and I've not been able to do enough research to kind of fully separate fact from fiction, but my favourite one is that he donated, when he died, he donated all of his magical tools to Newcastle Corporation, I think as a kind of, two fingers up to them really for having kicked him out of Newcastle, and it was like a joke. But I like to think that somewhere in the Civic Centre there's a hidden room that's got the grimoire of Black Jackie Johnson is hidden away somewhere.
I can't help thinking that's the kind of thing that the Lit and Phil would have, because you know how they're really into science and technology. What is magic if just not another kind of technology?
Indeed, yes. The art and science of causing change to occur in accordance with your will.
Exactly. And the last thing I wanted to ask is, and this is more of a thought experiment than an actual question, it's impossible to really know this, but we do only ever really know about witches and cunning men when they appear in the records, because how else could we know about them? But then that does mean that there's all these potential for other people who maybe did practice some kind of craft, or indeed cunning folks who have existed, but we don't know because they just weren't written about. So is it likely that the Castle Garth area, given how densely packed it was, might have had its own cunning person at some point, do you think?
I would love to think so. And I'm sure it must have done at some point. For those that don't know the castle and the area around it, the Castle Garth is like an old Geordie word, I suppose. It's kind of related etymologically to yard and to earth. Midan Gjarth in Old English is Middle Earth, the middle enclosure. It just really means the area surrounded by the castle walls. And in the 17th century, and increasingly in the 18th, early 19th centuries, becomes very, very packed with slum housing, religious dissenting meeting houses, pubs, very, very dubious places of business on the whole. And the reason for that is that in the 1400s, Newcastle is separated off from Northumberland, becomes a county in its own right, with its own sheriffs and bailiffs and all these other officers that the county has. But the castle is not included in that grant. So the very castle that gives Newcastle its name is not technically part of the town for a lot of its history, remains part of the county of Northumberland. And what that means is the town authorities have no sway there, which means that the guilds and the merchants and all these rich kind of guys who run the town cannot do anything to you when you're in the Castle Garth. In the 1500s, we're told that rogues and vagabonds are dwelling within the walls of the castle and nightly hie out to do mischief in the town. And there's nothing the town authorities could do about it because they couldn't enter the grounds of the castle to arrest them. That was out of their jurisdiction. Later on, all of the Scottish and Irish immigrants who come into Newcastle, a lot of them set up business in the Castle Garth because they're not allowed to set up business in the town by the guilds. Scottish people particularly are banned from owning businesses in Newcastle in the 1700s. So they set up in the Garth as well. And so, what better place to hide out hidden from the town authorities, plying your magical trade, than in the Castle Garth. And so I'm certain that they must have lurked in the back rooms of the Three Bulls Heads and places like that.
I like to hope that they do. I'm also just thinking about all of the ancestors on my mum's side who are Scottish, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they all ended up in the Garth. That would explain so much. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating area, and obviously I'm biased, you're biased, but I do think that if anyone is in Newcastle, I would recommend coming and having a look. Come and have a look at the castle. And I mean, most people on TripAdvisor seem obsessed with the views from the roof.
Yes, it's a big selling point. We've got we're kind of on a nice little rocky outcrop overlooking the River Tyne, so you do get absolutely magnificent views from the roof of the keep. But yeah, if you're into medieval stuff, then I think it's much more exciting that the keep in Newcastle is actually a pretty intact medieval keep, so you can kind of explore all of the corridors and staircases and different floors and stuff. It's not been sort of knocked through into a fancy modern house, and it's not just a shell ruin it. You can still actually go around all of the sort of corridors and things.
It's designed by the same guy who did Dover Castle, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Maurice the Cementer. Absolutely brilliant name. Who is Maurice, sometimes called Maurice the Engineer in sources as well, but he was Henry II's one of his master masons. And built Dover Castle as well. In some ways, Newcastle and Dover are Newcastle's like a mini Dover Castle. The keep particularly is about half scale. One of Dover. It's possible that they were just doing a little it's like a test run.
The feasibility study. Dover Castle is a cool place to visit, but I'm biased because Newcastle's.
Yeah, Newcastle's obviously cooler just because it's in Newcastle. But
well, exactly. Even if people think it's too far north, but never mind. But thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting chatting to you.
Yeah, it's been lovely talking to you, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.